Hello and welcome to the second lecture for topic 2, and in this we're going to be taking a look at the United States Constitution. So what are we going to be covering in this lecture? Well, first we're going to take a look at the pathway from the first Constitution of the United States, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, to the second Constitution of the United States, the Constitution that we have today, which is known as the United States Constitution. We'll then do a brief outline of what is contained in the Constitution, sort of a roadmap, so that you know how to navigate the Constitution as you are reading through it. And then we're going to talk about the architecture of democracy, how the framers of the United States Constitution had certain assumptions about human nature, and that they knew that democracy was a sort of an unstable form of government. So that they wanted to create a blueprint for our government that worked with human nature and also gave the structure or the architecture for a long-lasting democracy. So let's go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned in the first lecture, there were two documents that were associated with the first founding. The first one is the Declaration of Independence, and the second one is the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. And this is basically the first Constitution of the United States. So the Declaration of Independence declares that we are going to be an independent country, but we need to have a blueprint for how this new country is going to be governed. What are going to be the governmental institutions? How much power is the national government going to have? And so that's what the Articles of Confederation is. It establishes the governmental institutions for this new nation and identifies the powers of the national government. Now, there were very specific goals with the Articles of Confederation, and the goals were to basically give the most of the power to the states and severely limit the power of the national government. And that makes sense. The colonies just got out of an abusive relationship with the King of Great Britain, right? And they were really, really wearisome of power being centralized in the hands of any one entity, whether that be the King of England or whether that be a new national government. And so the Articles of Confederation wanted to make sure that the vast majority of power was given to the states and that there were very few powers that the national governments had. And so there were different ways of achieving this sort of power to the states, limited power to the national government. For one, there was only one national governmental institution, and that was the Congress of the Confederation. Okay. And so a confederation, the Articles of Confederation creates a confederation, and basically that's a league of states. Okay. So it's sort of like, it's basically saying that we are a nation, but we are a nation that is comprised of these sort of sovereign states, okay? And so again, kind of diffusing that power. And they basically say, and we're going to have this federal government, but it's going to be really limited. There's only going to be one body of the national government, the Congress of the Confederation. Each state has one vote in that Congress of Confederation, and so all the states are powerful. And while the federal government can do things, it can declare war, create treaties, appropriate money, it must have 9 out of the 13 states supermajority to actually get those things done. It didn't have a standing army. It could appoint generals to a U.S. army, but the army itself was comprised of the various state militias. It can't raise taxes on its own. It could only ask for money from states to pay off the debts, which is a real problem because we owed a lot of money to France, who helped us in the Revolutionary War. So, the Articles of Confederation is really about consolidating sovereignty in the states with having very few limited powers that were granted expressly to the national government of the United States. So as your textbook points out, because there were such extreme limits placed on the power of the national government, it made it really difficult for the national government to actually govern. And it made the Articles as a constitution impractical and unworkable. As I stated before, we had a large debt to France. We weren't able to raise money to pay off our debt, so it sort of reduced our standing internationally. While the federal government could negotiate trades or could negotiate treaties and trades with other countries, so could states. And so that, that internationally was sort of like, well, who's at the helm here? Is it the national government or is it the states? And also the United States was the national government was really limited in terms of its ability to regulate trade and commerce between the states, which led to some economic problems. So, and other things you'll read about in the textbook. So it became clear that there needed to be some changes made to the Articles of Confederation. So in 1786, state delegates attended what was known as the Annapolis Convention in Annapolis, Maryland, to discuss the problems with the Articles of Confederation. And out of that, they decided to send delegates to Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation, and that's what became the Constitutional Convention. But once the delegates got to Philadelphia, it was clear that they were going to throw out the Articles of Confederation and actually create a whole new constitution for the United States of America. So it was in Philadelphia in the state of Pennsylvania where the Constitutional Convention was held. And it was held in the summer and the early fall of 1787. And as your textbook points out, that there were some consensus in terms of what delegates agreed upon at the convention. There was conflict, and then clearly there was compromise as well. But before we move forward and take a look at some of the what happened at the Constitutional Convention, let's just look at an outline of the major articles within the Constitution itself. Okay, so the Constitution is comprised of 7 articles and 27 amendments to the Constitution. And when we get to our section on civil liberties, which is coming up in a few weeks, we're going to dig in much more to those first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, which makes up the Bill of Rights. So Articles 1, 2, and 3 are the articles that establish the institutions of the government of the United States. Article 1 establishes the Congress of the United States. That is the lawmaking branch, the legislature. And as we'll see in a moment, the Congress is bicameral. It means that it is made up of 2 chambers, one, the House of Representatives, and the other, the United States Senate. Article 2 is dedicated to the second branch of national government, and it determines the powers and duties of the President of the United States. And then Article 3 is the third branch, which is the federal judiciary. So what are the other articles? 1, Congress. 2, presidency. 3, the judiciary. What about the other articles? Well, Article 4 is an article that we're going to be getting into next week when we talk and learn about the concept of federalism. And federalism is this power sharing relationship between the national government and the states. So, here we are creating this new constitution, and it is creating this massive, much larger federal government, right? It's not just one institution now, it's 3 institutions of government. And these 3 institutions have a lot of power. And that was, sort of a cause for controversy as the states were asked to ratify the Constitution. And so, in Article 4, that it talks about what the relationships that the states have to each other and the relationship that it has to the national government, and also how states, are admitted to the Union, the United States of America, if we want to grow the number of states, which we have from 13 to 50. So Article 4 deals with the states, and we'll talk about that more next week. Article 5 tells us how to amend the Constitution. It's extraordinarily difficult to amend the United States Constitution. That's why we have 27 amendments only. And you'll be reading about the 4 paths of the how the Constitution can be amended in your textbook. Article 6 is the article that has to do with the legal status of the Constitution. Then when you read through Article 6, which I encourage you to do, it basically is saying that the Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the land, and that really needed to be stated since we had just moved out of a confederation. It's basically saying that federal law trumps state law. At the end of the day, federal law is supreme. But it's also saying that all governmental actors pledge allegiance to the United States Constitution, that is the document that guides the actions of the members of government, both at the state and federal and local level. Okay, so the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And Article 7 is the criteria for how to ratify the Constitution at that time. And that 9 of the 13 states needed to be on board for the ratification. So that's an overview. And clearly, we're going to be digging into each of these articles as we move throughout the semester, as we learn about Congress, the presidency, the judiciary, and so forth. But this kind of just gives you the lay of the land as you are reading through it. So, as we know, the United States is a democracy, rule of the people. And at the time when the United States was founded, and at the time of the framing of the Constitution in Philadelphia, that there was internationally and at home as well a concern that democracy was an unstable, worrisome type, and potentially even dangerous type of government. And so, we think about democracy today and we sort of evaluate the world in terms of how much spread of democracy that we have. It's seen as a good form of government. But in the 18th century, it was seen as a dangerous form of government. And why was that? Well, there was a sense of, and you sort of see this with Enlightenment thinking sort of changing the way we think about this. But, there was a sense that, do people really have the capacity to govern? Do they have the capacity to rule? That when you think about human nature and the assumptions that are made about human nature, that even the Enlightenment thinkers would think, well, yes, people have the capacity to reason and that progress is possible. But they were realists too. They said that, human nature at its core is that humans are self-interested. They seek out power, that they might put their own concerns and the concerns of their immediate family and tribe ahead of the concerns of the broader, common good. And that, yes, we have the capacity to be reasonable, but we're also swept up in passion and make unreasonable decisions based on irrationalities. And so, the thinking was that given the nature of humans, that giving humans a lot of say, people a lot of say in governance could actually be harmful. That if we say, democracy is what the majority wants, well, the majority could become a tyrant, right? That because humans are self-interested, that they might just do what's good for the majority of people, and they might not look and take consideration of the interests of those who are not in the majority. Also, that when you let people vote, there's a potential that they might be lured into, electing a demagogue. A demagogue is somebody who sort of appeals to people's desires and their darker selves and their prejudice, and with the promises of change. And then they might, elect a demagogue that could then, govern as an authoritarian right after they get power. So there was a lot of concern, that the framers had, and that was held worldwide, that democracy it has a lot of challenges, and those challenges can actually be harmful. And so in creating this new democracy, and we sort of, writing this new constitution, right? Because we even were beginning to see some of those harms out of the Articles of Confederation, which you'll read about in your textbook. There's a real concern that a constitution was written to address these dangers, these potential dangers of a democratic form of government. So in crafting the Constitution, the framers were really wanting to create a mechanism of government, a architecture of American democracy that would address these dangers. In order to, if you address these dangers and if you try to control these dangers, then we can have democracy, but it will be democracy in a way that is not going to be harmful because these dangers are going to be kept in check. And so one of the things, and we'll talk about the specifics of how they achieved this in the Constitution, is that the framers wanted to make sure that there were barriers in place to majority rule. That yes, that in a democracy, that what the majority wants is usually what is enacted, right? Majority rule. But you want to make sure that majority rule doesn't run over the desires of those who are not in the majority. And so you're going to see that in the way that the mechanisms of the Constitution are created, that it's really difficult to get anything done just with a majority of the people, okay? That oftentimes you need to have two majorities, one in the House and one in the Senate, and sometimes you need a supermajority. And so there's oftentimes breaks that are put in the way of just straight up 50% plus one majority rule. You're also going to see that the Constitution reduces opportunities for people to directly rule, okay? We are a democracy, but the framers were really concerned with this thing your textbook calls excessive democracy, giving people too much of an opportunity to govern. And so they wanted people to we wanted to know what the will of the people was through elections, but there were times when we figured out what the people wanted in an indirect way. And I'll talk about more about that specifically in a moment. Also, that we knew that government itself is comprised of people who are, have the same human natures as those who are being governed over. And so that the framers were really mindful to create a constitution that put a lot of checks on governmental power and also diffused governmental power, didn't consolidate it into one institution, but diffused it over multiple institutions. So let's dig into these in more detail to see how these controls that were put in place to keep sort of democracy functioning, how those were embedded in the Constitution. So as you'll read about in your textbook, and as you probably know from having taken an American government class in high school, that one of the main ways that the concerns about majority rule and those in the majority becoming a tyrant, basically imposing their will on people and not taking the concerns of those who aren't in the majority into consideration, one of the main checks that was placed on tyranny of the majority, on majority rule, was in the plans that were presented at the Constitutional Convention regarding representation. And we're probably familiar with these plans from high school government. But if you're not, here is a refresher. So there were two plans that were discussed at the Constitutional Convention. One was known as the Virginia Plan, and the other was the New Jersey Plan. And Virginia was the most populous state in the nation at that time. And as from their perspective, since they had the most population, they felt like that state should have the most say. And the plan that Virginia put forth was sort of magnified the power of the majority. They wanted the Congress to be based on population. And that they wanted it to be a bicameral Congress, but that bicameral Congress, that the House of Representatives, one chamber would be based on population, but so would the other chamber. It would also be based on population. So the more populous your state is, the more control you're going to have in government. Okay. They also wanted to have in the Virginia plan, we'll get to the New Jersey plan in a second, the Virginia plan also wanted a parliamentary style of government. A parliamentary style of government is where you merge the executive power with the legislative power. And so the Virginia plan said that it was the Congress who would decide who the executive would be. And so when you think about Great Britain, that's how they have a parliamentary style of government. They have a parliament, and whatever party has the majority in parliament, they select the prime minister. Okay, we don't ask the people to select the prime minister. The parliament selects the prime minister, who serves as the executive of the country. And so you can see that really magnifies the majority, right? Almost to the point of it being a tyranny of the majority. Now, the New Jersey plan, a smaller state, less populous, was like, wait a second, right? I mean, it saw the writing on the wall, and it really said, like, this democracy is not going to work if we let the majority put no brakes on the majority power. That those who are not in the majority, that their concerns need to be taken into consideration when making laws for this nation. And so New Jersey said that they wanted states to be equal players. It didn't matter how many people lived in your state, that everybody got an equal say. And they also wanted just one house of the legislature. They wanted it to be unicameral. And then also they wanted the powers separated out, right? So you'd have a Congress, but then you would have a separate executive branch, and obviously a separate judiciary as well. And so the New Jersey plan is almost a polar opposite, because it really reduces the power of the majority, and it gives states, regardless of their population, a lot more say in government. Well, as you can tell, we've got a little bit of both. And so, in fact, the Virginia plan actually had enough votes to pass at the Constitutional Convention. And so if majority was to rule that our government, the Constitution, would be based on the plan that Virginia put forth. But they agreed that since important states like New Jersey, New York, and Delaware weren't in agreement with that plan, they knew that even though they had the votes to put it forward, they knew that that would be disaster. Okay. And so Connecticut put forward the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise takes a little bit from both. It has a bicameral legislature, the House and the Senate. Only the House is based on population. The Senate, as we know, every state gets 2 senators. And that also that all states are equal in representation. And they also adopted separation of powers, so that not all the power was consolidated into the hands of a Congress. And so, this really makes it, puts the brakes on the tyranny of the majority. Not only do laws have to work their way through 2 houses and get a majority in each, but the minority, the smaller states, actually get more say in the Senate, and that can kind of put the brakes on the House that is based purely on population. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, that in some democracies, power is merged. The power of the legislative branch and the power of the executive branch is merged into one basic institution, Parliament, and then the Prime Minister is basically a part of Parliament. They're selected by Parliament. As we know, that was an idea in the Virginia plan that was thrown out, and the framers chose separation of powers. And separation of powers is where you have power that is divided into distinct institutions. So there's specific lawmaking powers, that's in one branch of government. Specific executive powers, it's in another branch of government. Specific judicial powers in another branch of government. And the idea is that in separating those powers, that it's less likely that the power is going to be abused. Now, one of the benefits of parliamentary government is that we can hold people accountable. If government doesn't get things done, then we hold Parliament responsible for that. In our separation of powers, things may not get done, but we're not exactly sure who to blame, right? Is it Congress that didn't get it done? Is it the presidency that it didn't get it done? Did the judiciary rule in a way that led to policies not being enacted? And so there's a downside to the division of powers. But as I mentioned, our framers were really concerned about the abuse of power, and they felt using separation of powers was the best way of putting a real brake on people in government abusing powers. And so each institution has its own distinct powers, but they also have their own distinct terms and their own distinct means of elections. And so, as we know, the legislature, one branch of the legislature is directly elected, so you get some democracy there. But the Senate initially was not directly elected. It was the state legislatures that selected who they wanted their federal senators to be. And so it was very indirect, because you could choose your state lawmakers, but the state lawmakers were the ones who chose. And there was more indirect, again, tamping down on excessive democracy in the selection of the executive. As we know, we don't have a direct election for the president of the United States. It goes through the Electoral College, right? And the thinking was that the Electoral College was supposed to put the brakes on the election of a demagogue, right? Because the electors could sit back and they wouldn't be lured into promises and feeding into their, sort of prejudices and desires, but they would be the sort of gatekeeper to say, nope, that person's not responsible for the presidency. And then the judiciary as well, not elected, has lifetime terms, while the House has 2-year terms, Senate has 6-year terms, and the presidency has 4-year terms. And so the thinking is that it's easy to hold people accountable if the power is defined. So we know what the lawmaking branch is supposed to do. We know what the executive is supposed to do. And since we have the very terms in elections, it really puts this brake on excessive democracy. Another concern of the framers. I will leave it to you to look at the cool graph in your textbook that shows basically the powers of the legislative branch, the powers of the executive branch, and the powers of the judiciary. Okay. What's cool about separation of powers too is it kind of works with human nature in that there's going to be a vigorous sort of competition or conflict between these two branches. If the executive branch, and let me put on my magic pen here, if the executive branch starts dancing and doing things that the legislative branch is designated to do within the Constitution, because the Constitution says only the legislative branch can do this. Well, if the executive branch starts doing powers that is designated to the legislative branch pushes back and says, get out of our lane, right? That is the job of the legislature. It's not the job of the executor. Same with the legislative branch. If the legislative branch starts doing things such as, engaging in some activities that it's exclusive to the executive branch will say, back off. And then the judiciary, has its own powers, but it also will resolve the disputes between the powers that might arise between the legislative and the executive branch. So that's what's kind of cool about separation of powers, because it actually works with human nature, right? Self-interested, we're lawmakers. Self-interested, we're the executive branch. But it works in such a way that it places a check on the abuse of power. So separation of powers is one way to put a check on government abusing its power. Another way is instituting checks and balances. And so this is another feature of the architecture of democracy. Checks and balances is basically that each branch participates and influences the other branch. It's very difficult for any one branch of government to get anything done without the input of an approval of the other branch. So for example, with checks and balances, branches can't exercise power without the oversight and participation of another branch of government. So for example, when it comes that the legislature has some oversight of the executive branch. In other words, the executive branch can't do things without the approval of the legislature. And so for example, if the executive branch vetoes a law, then the legislative branch could override that veto. Okay, so veto itself doesn't stand, that it could be overridden. If the executive branch abuses its power, the legislature has the power to impeach and remove a president. If the executive branch is engaging in an abuse of its powers, sort of like during the Iraq War, that there were scandals in the military prisons in Iraq in terms of the treatment of the detainees. Well, the legislature had an investigation of the Department of Defense to get to the bottom of why prisoners were being abused. And so that's a good example of the oversight that the legislature has over the executive branch. The executive has oversight over the legislature. The legislature passes a law. The president can veto that law. If there is a tie in the congressional branch, the executive branch breaks that tie through the vice president, who serves as the president of the Senate, but is a member of the executive branch. If the president doesn't think that the Congress is doing their job, they can call a special session to deal with a problem that's facing the nation. And then the judicial has oversight over both the executive and legislative branch, in particular that they exercise judicial review. That is, that if a law is unconstitutional or an action of the executive branch is deemed unconstitutional or is thought to be unconstitutional, if the Supreme Court says, yes, indeed, that's an unconstitutional law, it's nullified. And if the Supreme Court says that action of the executive branch is unconstitutional, it is nullified. So all of these are examples of that checks placed on government through checks and balances. And again, here is just the handy slide that is in your textbook, so you can take a look at all the different ways beyond what we just talked about in lecture, about the ways in which the three branches check, balance, and then through that check and balance, hopefully compromise to actually address problems within the nation. So here at the end of the lecture, I want us to just take a moment to think critically about how strong is the structure of American democracy. The framers were really concerned about majority rule, government abusing its power, and excessive democracy, right? So they craft this government that places a check on these or controls for these dangers. I sort of wonder if the framers came back today in 2022 and they saw how our democracy was going, if they would make any changes to the Constitution that we have today. For one thing, that, while the framers were very concerned about the majority trampling on the concerns of the minority. So, and again, minority, we're not talking here about racial or ethnic minorities. We're just talking about people who aren't in the majority, like somebody who's not in the 50% plus one. Today, that seems to be sort of an opposite concern. We're not so much concerned about tyranny of the majority anymore, but rather tyranny of the minority. Because, the way our government is structured gives a lot of power to those in who aren't in the 50%. And some are sort of, saying that the United States is sort of maybe moving towards a counter-majoritarian type of democratic system, or just system. I'm sure you can even call that a democracy. And that's where the minority, that is those who are not in the 50% plus one, can consistently thwart the will of the majority. And we were sort of talking about this last week, where the majority of Americans want one thing, but that doesn't seem to get expressed in legislature. And why might that be? Well, and in part it has to do with something that's not even has to do with the Constitution, but it's the filibuster that's used in the Senate. The filibuster is just a procedural rule in the Senate. But to get things done in the Senate, you need to have 60 senators. And if you don't have 60 senators, then you can't get legislation through the Senate. And right now the Senate is divided equally 50-50. But not only that there's a concern that, the framers wanted to make sure that smaller states, had a voice, or less populous states had a voice in the Senate. But, the ratio between the population ratio between the most populous state and the least populous state in 1790 was 12-1. Today, the ratio is 68-1, right? And so the most populous state being California and the least populous state being Wyoming, but they both get 2 senators. And so by 2040, 70% of the population will live in 15 states, but they will only get 30% of representation in the Senate. So you kind of wonder if the framers came back and looked at that, if they might be like, hey, maybe we need to change the architecture of the democracy. Because you want to make sure that that there are breaks on the majority, but not to the point where, a strong will of the majority still can't penetrate and get, enacted in terms of our national legislature. And, you might look at some recent Supreme Court decisions, in particular, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, that seems to be sort of out of step with public opinion within the United States. And so potentially 5 people on the Supreme Court, that make a decision that, is somewhat out of line with the majority and really more of the supermajority of the opinion in the United States. And then there's also concerns over not having too much democracy, right? So with the Electoral College being the entity that selects the president, and was like, well, we don't want the people to be too involved. But there, in the last, since 2000, 2 elections, what the majority of the people wanted in terms of the popular election didn't result in who became the president of the United States. And so there's some concerns about that indirect election of the president of the United States by the Electoral College, and that whether or not that's actually doing more harm for our democracy than good. So just some things to think about that, also due to just sort of the tribes within our political tribes and how deeply polarized we are as a nation, that while checks and balance are good because you get overcheck of one, the House by the Senate and the executive branch oversights the legislature, it's not leading to compromise, right? It's like that the idea was, if you need to get things done, you need to have the input of different branches within our government. But those checks and balances are really leading more to gridlock and not finding a space for compromise, due in part to how polarized we are. All right, that's it for me today. I know that these lectures this week were a little bit longer, I think, than last week, and it's some heavy material. So I really appreciate you paying attention. I appreciate your time and attention, and I will talk to you again next week.